Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the games in the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, and we're looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. This is game number 30 and it's the last game of Emanuel Lasker's little series that we're looking at. And Lasker has the black pieces. His opponent is Akiba Rubinstein, who has a dedicated, and Rubinstein has a dedicated chapter later on in the book. So we will be seeing a lot more of Rubinstein in the future. Now this game starts off with d4, going into the queen's pawn opening, d5, c4, going into the queen's gambit, and Reti offers a nice little bit of analysis into here. We've looked briefly at the Queen's Gambit before, but not in much depth. First of all, Reti says that this pawn is under attack, and defending it with knight f6 is one option which Reti gives, but he says that this is quite a poor move because after pawn takes, knight takes, e4, and white's got this very nice centre. And if the queen were to take back after knight to here, let's say queen d8, queen a5 might be another option. Again, white has a very nice centre. And white's just clearly better here. So knight f6 to defend this d5 pawn is a move commonly played by beginners, but it's not very good. So instead, Reti looks mainly at the moves e6 and the moves c6. Now he says that e6 looks perhaps a little bit more natural, because the move c6 removes the c6 square for this knight. The knight can no longer go to c6 if there's a pawn there. And Reti also talks about the potential pawn breaks in d4, d5 openings. So if we look at, say, e4, e5 openings, the pawn breaks for white, well, here, after some preparation, let's say we play this, go into the Scotch. In this situation, the pawn breaks for black is usually d5 or f5. In the Scotch, it's very normally d5. And that's how black will gain more space. If they have the pawn on d6, then we've discussed this pawn formation quite often, where white has a space advantage. e4 pawn versus a d6 pawn gives white an advantage. So in d4, d5 positions, the main pawn break would be either e4 or c5. So after, say, this exchange, c5 is the main pawn break you might play to try and open up the position and gain more space. And e5 may be another option. Now, Reti talks that c5 is perhaps a better choice to try and open up the centre and free up your position, because c5 is going to be defended by this bishop, whereas e5 hasn't got any defenders. Currently, the e5 square is under white's control, so we don't really want to be trying to push e5 without a lot of preparation. So when we're looking at the potential moves to defend this d5 pawn, knight f6 doesn't work, so we could be looking at e6, or we could be looking at c6. c6 means that we're going to be spending another move to try and push the c5 pawn. So we'll be sort of down a tempo. Now, in addition to this, Reti also talks about the potential for where this knight wants to go. So he says that c6 does block in this knight, it stops the knight going to c6. However, knight to c6 here, this is the Shigurin defense, and Reti does comment on it being a potential option. However, it's very complex, and he doesn't go into any depth at all, saying it would need its own little book. But he says that with one exception of the Shigorian defense, generally speaking, you want to have this knight behind this pawn. You don't want to block in this c5 pawn break, because that's the easiest pawn break to play, and that's the easiest one to free up a position. So he says that in d4, d5 openings, you very often want to avoid moving this knight until you've played c5, or you perhaps want to play knight d7 to support c5. Now, he's commented that with this in mind, the move e6 may be the more natural move to make, because you're enabling c5 to be played a little bit sooner because it's protected by the bishop. And then if you get c5 in, you may also be able to play knight to c6. However, he does comment about some of the drawbacks of e6. And he says that in queen's pawn openings, so d4, d5 openings, both pawns are protected by the queens. So this means that it's going to be a little bit harder to try and open up the center, and exchange off a lot of the central pawns, because both of these pawns are protected. So this means that we're going to end up naturally in more closed positions than we would in e4, e5 games. And in closed positions, the activity of your pieces, particularly bishops, is something to bear in mind. So with the move e6, this bishop is being locked in behind this pawn chain, whereas white's bishop is free to develop. And, you know, if we were to play a few moves now, let's bring out the knights first. You know, this is one example of something that might occur in the Queen's Gambit declined. And here white is able to bring their bishop outside of the pawn chain. So when they play e3, let's just play c5 now. It's not a good move now, but now after they play e3, this bishop is outside of the pawn chain, whereas black's bishop is inside the pawn chain. And I think Reti talks about this being quite an important difference, because it's a small advantage, but it is an advantage for white. And that's probably the main drawback of the e6 move in the Queen's Gambit, is that you're blocking in this bishop. And in fact, he actually says that one of the main ideas of the Queen's Gambit declined for black, of playing this e6, is simply developing this bishop. If you get this bishop developed to a good square, then your opening is, generally speaking, a lot more successful, because this bishop's on the same colour square as your pawn, so you don't want it to be locked in. However, c6, although it has the disadvantages of perhaps being a bit harder to achieve any pawn breaks, it does allow this bishop to come out along the diagonal. So it is perhaps a little bit better. And here in the game we see e6. Now, something else that white has to bear in mind here is, if they were to just develop normally, after d takes c5, there's the potential to try and play b5 to hold on to this pawn. And usually, in a normal Queen's Gambit it's accepted, after this, let's say you were to try and develop attacking this, if you play b5 now to defend the pawn, then something like knight c3 would then attack this b5 pawn, and it gets into a bit more complications. However, after d takes c5 here, if you try and recapture the pawn with the bishop now, b5 now is no longer under attack by the knight. So it makes things a little bit more complicated. And because of that, in the game, we saw c6, but we also saw e3, shutting in this bishop but immediately defending this c4 pawn, basically avoiding a lot of the complications. Now here we see knight f6 from Lasker, knight c3, and now he plays e6, shutting in his own bishop. Now it's worth noting that bishop f5, Reti comments that this might be a little bit premature, because after c takes d5, c takes d5, queen b3 can be awkward to meet for black. I believe it is possible to meet this. Something like queen d7 might be an option, queen c8, but it's important to note that well, queen c8 actually loses a pawn, so queen d7 might be the best option. But it's important to note that this is an attack which white can play quite often if black develops their bishop a little bit too early. And Lasker just wanted to avoid some of these complications, obviously, and played e6. Now here we had knight f3, knight b to d7, bishop to d3, and d takes c4. Now, this exchange, according to Reti, was played by Rubinstein in a tournament in 1924, and it's still played today. It's called the Moran variation, and the idea is that you wait until this bishop's developed before you take, forcing the bishop to move again, and then you play b5, this is all what happened in the game. And at the time, bishop d3, well, bishop d3 is the main move here. It's played a lot more often, and but it's got quite a few more complications. And at the time, the theory was still developing. So here, Rubinstein played bishop e2. Now, in this position, Rubinstein's main idea was to try and play b3 and develop his bishop to b2, but also he retreated his bishop back to e3 instead of d3. It's perhaps a bit more active than d3, but the idea of bishop e2 is after black plays their bishop to b7, white is able to bring their bishop to f3 after moving this knight in order to challenge the more powerful black bishop. And also after b2, bishop b2, white is hoping to try and exchange this d4 pawn for the c pawn after c5 is played, which would open up the long diagonal for the bishop. Now if we did see bishop d3, the potential might be something like bishop d7, castles, a6, and then we might even see something like e4 and c5. It's the position gets a bit more complicated, and this is quite commonly played today, this line. But Rubinstein wanted to avoid some of the more complicated theory that was still being developed. So he plays bishop e2, and reserving the chance to play bishop f3 to challenge this bishop in the future. We see a6, castles, and our bishop to b7, developing a slight square bishop, and this bishop's going to become quite powerful after c5 is pushed. We now see b3, intending to develop the dark square bishop, bishop to e7, bishop to b2, castles, and now we see knight e5. And Reti comments that this looked like quite a logical move. After c5, black's dark square bishop is going to be quite strong, and white would like to exchange this bishop for his own bishop by playing bishop f3. And freeing up this bishop to come out of the pawn chain also allows this queen to have the square e2, which it probably wants to sit on more than it does on any of the other squares. Now here, black plays c5, We see bishop f3, queen to c7, and now we see knight takes knight and knight takes knight. Now this is something that Reti comments on, that black wants to take back with their knight, because after this capture, black wants to be able to capture back with their own knight. And the reason for this is after this capture, this knight would be pressuring the d3 and the e4 squares, which after the exchange of bishops may be quite weak, and there may be the chance of creating some form of outpost or something similar on these two squares. So after knight takes, we don't see d takes c5 just yet. Instead, Rubinstein plays knight to e4. So this knight e4 move adds another attacker to the c5 pawn, which is basically intending, therefore, to try and exchange these two knights if the pawns are exchanged. Now Lasker responds to this with rook a to d8. And Reti comments that this move is a bit curious at first, but it actually makes quite a bit of sense. The normal place for the rooks are d8 and c8. So you'd naturally think this rook will come to d8 and this rook to c8, because the e-file isn't about to open anytime soon. So after rook to d8, what's this rook doing? It's not really going to be doing anything. However, Reti comments that Lasker decides to move this rook first because he wants to play queen to b8, and obviously if he played queen b8 now, this rook is now permanently shut in. So he's willing to spend a few extra tempos by moving this rook first in order to play queen b8 at the right moment. So here Rubinstein responds with rook c1, and now Lasker plays queen b8, queen e2. Now the bishop's vacated this square, the queen can move there. And now we see c takes d4. Now, here we saw e takes d4. Reti comments that taking back with the bishop perhaps isn't too good, because e5 is an option, defended by the knight and the queen. And bishop c5 would perhaps... Reti doesn't really like this variation. He says it's probably white's best shot, but it just gives up the bishop pair and offers black some of the simplifications that he might want. And after bishop to b2, f5, the knight moves, and this bishop is lost because if it goes to h5, g6, and the bishop is just trapped. So taking back with the bishop isn't really an option. So instead we see e takes d4. And now we see another case where white has an isolated queen's pawn. So one of the main aims in IQB positions is to control the square in front of the pawn. White may want to try and control this d5 square and eventually get in a timely d5 pawn break, or possibly trade off this pawn for one of black's pawns. Now, obviously in this instance, because black has a pawn on e6 defending the d5 square, we have this bishop on b7 defending the d5 square, and after knight to p6 we'll then have the knight and the rook all defending the d5 square. So black probably has a slight advantage due to the pawn structure alone, because it's an IQP position, isolated queen pawn position, where black is able to fully control the square in front of the pawn. Now here we see rook to c8, challenging the open file, and now g3. And Reti comments with this move that Rubinstein is a bit limited in what he's actually able to do. He hasn't really got a huge amount of freedom, and g3 is sort of a multi-purpose move. It first of all helps control f4, which may be a potential outpost or something for the knights in the future. It also gives the king a potential flight square, because if the game turns into an endgame with the heavy pieces on the board, then back rank issues may occur. And it also allows the bishop to retreat to g2 a little bit easier. However, it does obviously have the drawback in that it weakens this diagonal, and Lasker takes advantage of that immediately, placing his queen on a8. And now I've got this queen and bishop battery straight down the weakened diagonal. Now here we see king to g2, defending this bishop. Rook f to d8. And now we see rook takes c8, rook takes c8, rook to c1, and a further exchange of rooks. And h6, just making some luft and potentially stopping any exchange of bishops, or stopping the knight going there as well. So here we see the bishop comes back to b2, where it is perhaps a bit more active. However, it is being blocked in by its own pawn. Knight to b6 and h3. And Reti comments that Rubinstein is playing very cautiously, very anxiously here. Rubinstein's got the worst position and he's struggling to play this worst position. Not too surprising, because it is a worse position. Reti comments that perhaps knight c5 may have been a bit better to try and get some counterplay. But we see h3, queen c8, and now queen d3. And here Reti stops and analyzes or evaluates the position a little bit. So first of all, he says that white is worse off because white has the isolated queen pawn and black controls the square in front of this pawn. Additionally, Reti also comments that the light square bishops facing each other are very likely to be traded off at some point. And this will mean that black will have a dark square bishop when most of his pawns are on light squares, whereas white will have a dark square bishop and his central pawn is on a dark square. And because of the control black has over d5, it's going to be difficult for him to push it and trade it off. Which means that this bishop for black will probably be a bit more superior to this bishop for white. And also because of black's control over d5, knight to d5 is a potential outpost square for the knight. Now, Reti comments that this on its own perhaps isn't enough to create a win. So therefore, Lasker tries to provoke some more weaknesses and improve his position and worsen his opponents first. So he does this by knight to d5, threatening knight to b4, which would attack the queen and this pawn, and something like queen b1 would just be sort of quite depressing, really. Black would just have a far better position and sooner or later would win one of these pawns. So he provokes a3 to try and prevent this knight b4 move. But notice how Lasker is trying to provoke these pawns coming up so they're fixed on dark squares. Lasker sees that these two bishops are very likely to be exchanged, and so they'll be left with dark square bishops only. So Lasker's trying to get his opponent's pawns onto the dark squares where they will be permanent weaknesses. And he's also hoping to try and provoke b4, because then after knight back to b6, the c4 square will then be weakened. So you see how the c4 square after the b4 will be quite a bit weaker. So let's say he plays it now. Well, this is just quite a bit better for black now. Black's got control of this c4 square. After these bishops come off the board, black is going to have a dark square bishop with his pawns on light squares, and white's dark square bishop is going to be limited in movement and his pawns are going to become targets. So that's Lasker's plan. So he plays knight back to b6, Now intending bishop to d5 to try and provoke this pawn moving forward. We see king h2, bishop to d5, king to g2, and it's clear that Rubinstein doesn't really know what to do in this position, moving the king backwards and forwards like that. And we see queen to c6, strengthening up this battery, knight to d2, and now we see a5, and Lasker's intending to try and push a4 to try and force the pawns to go in the wrong colour, and also to try and trade this a pawn for the b pawn, so he has a lot more control over this c4 square. Now here we see queen to c3, and Reti comments that this is a mistake. The queens are needed to stay on the board really, because with the queens on the board, Rubinstein will have additional counterplay. But with the queens off the board, Rubinstein's going to find it quite hard to get some counterplay. Now here, Lasker doesn't immediately take the queen. Instead, he takes the bishop first, because taking the bishop now, when the queen is defending the square, forces the knight to take back. Obviously, the king can't take back. Whereas if you took the queen first, now the king could take back. So the knight has to take, or the queen has to take. Now queen takes c3, it creates some difficulties. The threat is queen c2. However, this can be met with queen to c3, and this saves the day. But by throwing in the intermediate move, a knight to d5, this queen c2 threat is fairly unstoppable. The variation that Reti gives is you play queen e4, trying to defend this, then f4, the queen moves back, and queen c2 is coming. So queen takes f3 doesn't really work, so knight takes f3 is forced. And now we see the exchange of the queens. And note how with this knight takes f3 move, the knight is moving away from the queen side, which is where Lasker is currently trying to focus his attention. And that's why he exchanged the bishop first to force the knight away from the queen side. And now we see a3. Now, after b4, knight to c4, attacking this pawn. These pawns are fixed on dark squares, and this bishop has far less mobility, and I don't know why, it obviously can't move that way, but yeah, this bishop has far less mobility, and the knight is on a beautiful outpost, so black's clearly better here. So instead we see b takes a4. Reti does give a nice little alternative of bishop a5 first, essentially intending b takes a4, but trying to push this knight away first, because after b takes a4, this knight jumping to here is a potential option. So here we see Reti gives a variation bishop a5 first, trying to move this knight away from c4. However, after a takes b3, bishop takes b6, bishop to g5, this pawn is going to advance no matter what. A variation, I guess there's a few different variations depending on what computer you use. One might be something like h4, but still b2 might be coming. If you take the bishop first, still b2 will come. So bishop a5 was a variation given by Reti, which was nice to consider, but it obviously fails because the pawn's just too far forward. And this is where the knight perhaps being on f3 is even more essential. So instead we see b takes a4, b takes a4, and now king f1. White's trying to centralize the king as soon as possible. Now if instead we had something like bishop to b4, which is a variation Reti gives, b takes b4, a takes b4, a3 would then come, and white wouldn't be able to stop this pawn. The knight just wouldn't be in time to stop the pawn, and even if it is, and even if the knight's able to get there and the king's able to get there, this knight would be, well, both the king and knight would be over at the a file, while this knight could be gobbling up all of the other pawns. So instead we see king f1, which is perhaps the more principled way to play. Out of, if you have a couple of different plans in the endgame, if one of them involves centralizing the king, that should probably be given a bit more precedent. Now here we see bishop takes a3, king to e2, king f8, king to d3, knight to d5, centralizing the knight on a nice little outpost. And now we see bishop to e1. White doesn't want to trade the bishop for the knight. So we see bishop to d6, moving out the way so the pawn can advance. King to c4, king to e7, knight e5, and now we see bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and king to d7. So black simplified the position a little bit with this bishop takes knight, but black with this pawn here is going to be able to tie up this bishop. This bishop's going to be stuck defending this pawn from. His bishop's going to be stopping this pawn from advancing. So he doesn't really mind trading away because white will essentially be a piece down. Now here we see bishop to d2, h5, and now bishop to c1. Now Reti comments that white could win the pawn with king to b5, a3, bishop to c1, but then knight c3 check will come, king b4, a2. Obviously taking a knight would give you will give Lasker a queen. So bishop b2 is almost forced. But now knight to e4 would come, and after king b3 trying to win this pawn, the knight can just start gobbling up all of the kingside pawns, and in exchange for this pawn, black would have a very nice kingside majority. So here, instead of trying to win this pawn, Rubinstein plays bishop to c1. But here Lasker plays king to c6, bishop a3, blockading this pawn, knight to b6, king to d4, king to b5, bishop f8, oh sorry, that's c1, bishop to f8, knight to c4, king to c3, and now g6, stopping this pawn from being taken and putting all the pawns on light squares. You see f4, knight to e3, king to d3, and now knight to d5. And now the threat is potentially something like h4, which after this pawn takes, you can then take here with check and potentially win another pawn. So, and also Reti comments that if white plays h4 himself, then you're giving up this nice f5 square and the g4 square for the knight. And also note how all of these pawns are in the same colour square as this bishop. You see how Lasker has sort of manipulated the game from before the queens were even traded off to try and force or before the bishops were even traded, whilst both players had light square bishops. Lasker had manipulated the position to force the opponent's pawns onto dark squares. So here, Rubinstein plays bishop to a3, and h4 is played. So g takes h4, knight takes f4 check, king e4, and now knight h5. If the knight did take here, then after something like king f3, king c4, king g3, and this would be essentially a draw, because if the knight wants to move out the way, this if it goes to here, it will be taken. If it goes to there, it'll be taken. If it goes to there, it will be taken. So the only square for the knight is g1. But then after king f2, after king f2, controlling these squares, again the only square for the knight is here. And then king g3, and the knight will just be constantly moving backwards and forwards, and the king will be moving backwards and forwards. So we'll get into a drawn position. So Lasker doesn't take the pawn. Instead, he plays knight to h5. Now we see king f3, and this is an attempt, obviously, with the bishops, the pawns controlling these squares and the knight controlling this square. If white wants to move his king, it's going to be a bit awkward. But king f3 is an attempt to try and let's do it a different colour. Well, king f3 is an attempt to try and bring the king around to f3, to g4, to g5, to h6, to h7, to g8, and to try and win this f7 pawn. Rubinstein's just trying to get some counterplay, and the idea is that this pawn is stuck. So here we see Rubinstein playing king f3 to try and get his king to take this pawn. But after king c4, bishop b2, king to b3, bishop a1, a3. Now we see king g4 trying to go with the plan. King c2, king g5, and now king to d3. Here, Rubinstein resigns. And the reason is, even if white is able to win this f7 pawn, black will just post the king onto f5, where it will be defending both of these pawns. The knight will then be able to quite calmly mop up all the other pawns on the king side, perhaps not this one straight away, and would be able to try and trade this, or try and take this bishop, potentially after playing something like knight to c2 or knight to b3, queening this pawn and then taking the bishop for the new queen. And Rubinstein hasn't got anything to stop this plan. Yes, Rubinstein can win this pawn, but the king's going to get to f5 a lot sooner, and there's nothing Rubinstein can do about it. Black will be able to just very calmly mop up all the pawns, trade, eventually take this bishop, but potentially even just trade it for the knight. If black just has these two pawns left against just the two kings, then black will easily win. It would have no issue trading the knight for the bishop. So in this position, Rubinstein resigned. And so there we have it. That's game number 30. And that's the last game by Lasker of the book. And it's looking at another endgame. We haven't looked at too many endgames in this book so far, but I do quite like it. And it's quite instructive. We've obviously had quite a nice little introduction to the Queen's Gambit, but it's also quite instructive how even from the middle game, so even from right here, after this IQP, we saw Lasker anticipating the exchange of these bishops and immediately setting plans to try and change the pawn structure to benefit him after these bishops were exchanged, before they've even been exchanged, and to get into a favourable endgame, anticipating it may well just be a knight and bishop. So it's quite an instructive game. It sort of shows some of the strategic planning of some of these master players like Lasker. Yeah, it's quite an instructive endgame, actually. But anyway, that was game number 30. And if you did like it, please like, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.